Well, my body is ill, and I'm something like a zombie because for the most part I'm not sleeping a lot. And so I don't know how well this is going to come out. We'll forget all about all of that and just try to do it. This will be mostly introductions, about 4 of them. We are in the middle of a sub-series of a series that's been going on for about 6 or 7 years now. And in this general outlook, we are using the ideas of the mystery schools to understand and work with mythology. And one of the primary ideas of the mystery schools is that for juvenile humanity, going back hundreds of thousands of years, myths were given to humanity by the initiates as given by the gods. And the reason for this is after we asserted ourselves, our free will, and chose to do what we wanted to do, whether that was in harmony with the cosmos and the divine plan or not, then the gods who had completely controlled us before that had to have hands off as far as direct control. Previously, everything we did was controlled by the gods, very much in the way that the plants and animals are controlled by the gods now. That within a species consciousness, there is not a lot of leeway for behavior. Like pandas don't eat anything but bamboo shoots, and that's it, period. So the gods could only work on us indirectly, and they worked on us by influencing us. They influenced us indirectly through astrology, which influence they still have. However, we are free enough that we can choose to allow astrology to move us one way, or we can work completely against it, or we can creatively use the forces as we will. They also influenced us as race and cultural spirits. That when you're born to a different culture, you are given certain kinds of experiences so that your incarnation will be of a very specific type. That is the language, the dress, the food, the music, everything else is brought to you so that you get a certain type of experience. Among those cultural vehicles were the myths. When we first received the myths in late Lemuria, in early Atlantis, and continuously up until the last few hundreds of years, when we first received them, our consciousness was childlike. We were very simple, and in many ways we were very pure. In some parts of the world, at least if we can read the reports of the Hottentots of South Africa, this purity is still there. So we were like children in many regards. And like children love stories, we loved the stories, and they sank in on us. Our love, our devotion, our cheer was like little children's love, devotion, and cheer. Same thing with our anger. It came quickly and it went quickly. Even though we were capable of great destruction, because we were still magical. We had clairvoyance, and we knew how to manipulate the forces of nature, partly because of our purity. So, we did not have the technical consciousness and orientation to the world that we have today. We did have clairvoyance, we did have inner world abilities, but we were not technical. So most of what we hear about the Atlanteans or the Lemurians being technical wizards and having all kinds of great machines and things like that, most of that is baloney. There was some technical ability, and it was developed in a much different way. It wasn't developed in the way that we develop computers and things like that. And that leads us to one of our principles, I think, that is really important, and that is because we are conscious of something, in the clarity of that consciousness and the ability to communicate what we know from that consciousness, it seems like what we know in consciousness was always true and always the same. But it is not so. Other people at other times, even in our times, have a different kind of consciousness. And to try and judge other people or to try to understand other people in terms of our own consciousness is a very, very great error. It is true that there is one consciousness that permeates everything. However, we are far away from being awake in that ultimate unity that permeates everything. We have quite a bit to go through to get to that level of unity. So in our self-centeredness, we have to be very careful that we don't judge other people and other times by our own consciousness. So these stories were given by initiate leaders, and they're stories about the gods. And they were given by the gods who happen, who are the subject of them. And there is a reason for this. This is another great principle of the cosmos. There is no truth, there is no principle that lives abstract from everything. Truths and principles and ideas live in beings. All of us ourselves are living truths, and all of us are repositories of cosmic wisdom, which if we live it out, we become something like the gods, giving the truth to the cosmos from our being. So the principles, the lessons, everything that makes the cosmos exist lived and does live in beings. In this case, the gods. The truths and principles are not something that we study outside of us in a laboratory or in a studio or in a book or something like that. That's a really great mistake. To understand the truth, we must unify ourselves with it, and we must attune ourselves to it and see it as it lives. It is constantly a live thing, and it is important that we recognize that all of the time. Now, it's a peculiarity that us, in our entire being, even our physical being, we are the product and creation of the gods. And the gods gave of themselves to us. In fact, they realized their creations by giving themselves and almost to some extent dying in giving themselves into the creations. As a result, everything in our soul nature and even in our bodies, for example, the lungs, which are in a twin pair, are just like the principle and the myth of Gemini and the hierarchy of Gemini. And we have two distinct kinds of consciousness. We have an oxygen consciousness and we have a carbonation consciousness, depending on whether we are on the in-breath or whether we are on the out-breath. So the entire myth of the Gemini, of alternating life and death, or of awakening to oxygenated consciousness, or having another kind of consciousness that is a deathly consciousness that comes of almost being suffocated in our own carbon dioxide, that whole myth of the Gemini lives right in the lungs and in their functioning. So the gods are alive right in the organism of our being. And so when we hear the stories, whether we're conscious of it or not, something even right down to our somatic being responds to the gods, and it responds to the stories that have been told to them. And it is with this intent that the myths were given to us, so that we could take them from our experience and live them out into the world. These myths are not just scientific principles or psychological principles, though they all have that side. The most important part of them was inherent right in the story, and that is the moral. For the most part, in our evolution, in the way we have deviated, by asserting our self-consciousness and our free will, we have deviated selfishly. And in that selfishness, we have produced an adharmony with the rest of the cosmos. An adharmony that our selfishness tries to separate itself from all other living things. Just like we put all of our food in sanitized packages in the supermarket because we want it separated, we want it clean. We don't want to be right in nature because we don't want to be around all those insects and bacteria. If we could live like within a shell as we do in our cars, that would seem to be ideal to us. And for that reason, our selfishness, when the whole cosmos is based on creative giving, our selfishness is where we are most out of step and where we most lag in our cosmic evolution. And for that reason, the myths were so important in bringing us morals to every story. In fact, even as direct teachers have come about, like if we take Jesus or Krishna or Buddha or Muhammad, they didn't give us a science and they didn't give us a psychology. All of them, each and every one of them, had as the strongest part of their teaching the moral part of the teaching. And so as we tell these stories, we're trying to get at the moral part of the story so that we can live it in ourselves. Before passing on from this general introduction, there's one more thing that I would like to go into. This is the second general introduction. We have to be self-conscious about what we're doing all the time, because otherwise we forget what we're doing and we just get carried away selfishly in our own doing of things, and we never stop and ask, hey, what did I do there? Or what am I doing here? And if we really knew what we were doing, we wouldn't do a lot of the things that we do. Last semester we looked at the myth of Oedipus. And we looked at a lot of different things, but at one time we looked at the riddle of the Sphinx, which was solved by Oedipus. And that riddle went, what being with only one voice has sometimes 2 feet, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, and is weakest when it has the most? Oedipus' answer to that was man, because he crawls on all 4s as an infant when he also happens to be his weakest. He stands firmly on his 2 feet in the middle of his life when he is strongest, and he leans on a staff as an old person, and that was the solution, or at least the one word, human, was the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx. One of the ways we looked at that was that we looked at it also as being humanity, and that the 4 represented the material. Like the square has always represented the material world and the kind of objectification that comes from externalization into bodies. And so that the 4 represented our animal-like state when we were nothing but bodies, whereas the 3 represented our future state as human beings when we graduate beyond our mere physical existence and become spiritual beings, because 3, or the triangle, represents the spirit. But in between there, we are polar. We stand upright. And our consciousness is polar because physiologically, in fact, if you go to the university, everybody at the university will say that humans are animals, because physiologically we are. In our divine nature, or in our inner nature, we are gods. So we're polar, especially when we're doing something creative. We do something that has never been done before, and we give birth to something that comes right out of us. And so humans are bipolar right now. But that doesn't answer the question, or that unique question, of their strongest when they stand on the least. This is something we didn't go into at that time. Luckily, we get to do a retake on this and review the whole idea. And the peculiar kind of strength that we have as humans is most unusual. And that is, neither the animals or the creatures or the gods have much freeway or have much leeway. If you go way back, the further you get into the realm of creatures, the less the amount of leeway there is. Water has to always boil at the same temperature with the same pressure. In the mineral kingdom, behavior is extremely predictable. And as we said earlier, all oxen eat grass. It's not that you're going to suddenly see a cow run out there and take a bite out of a hyena or something like that, because they are subject to their own instincts, and they are subject to the laws that have been put on them by the animal group spirits. On the other hand, the gods are not free either. And they're not free because they are prisoners of truth. They understand that something is true, they affirm it, and they live it. And they're such that they don't have any choice that they can do any different. They're very much like St. Paul in the Bible, who says, "I, Paul, prisoner of Christ," because he's gotten to such a state that he realizes the validity of the truth of that altruistic love of Christ, that he's a prisoner to it, and he can't act any way but that way. But the peculiar circumstance that we have as bipolar bipeds is a kind of a renegade freedom. We don't have to follow our instincts if we don't want to. We don't even have to follow the stars if we don't want to. You know, if our instincts tell us we need brown rice, we can go out and eat mustard if we want to. And in the same way, we have a renegade kind of strength, or a renegade kind of freedom, that we don't even have to follow our intuition if we don't want to. In either case, we always pay by suffering, because the laws of nature that work in us as instincts are divinely guided, and the truth is the truth, and if we go against them, but we do have the freedom and we do have the strength to go against everything in the cosmos. It gives us a very unique outlook. It gives us an outlook that no other being in the cosmos has. And most probably wouldn't want to have it. But it gives us a kind of freedom that if we can expand that to everything that we do, so that as we become divine and we live according to the truth, we do it with the freedom known only from living without the truth. It means that we have a very special kind of understanding of things, and it makes us really strong. So, we've been talking about all of this in terms of the caduceus of Mercury. And we said that we are at the point now where we are leaping from the serpentine path of involution, where we are creatures, to the serpentine path of evolution, where we come back out of matter into our divine nature as creative gods. And when we go from creatures to creators, and we have that special kind of strength or that special kind of freedom, we're taking a leap of faith. And there is a special kind of freedom. If we want, we can even stay in the gap, and then the gap becomes the abyss, and we fall into an empty nothingness. But we have that freedom. Now, with that freedom, where we're taking this leap of faith like Tarzan from tree to tree, in this case from snake to snake, we have an unusual kind of bipolar consciousness available to us. It used to be that our perception was like the perception that most animals have. We perceived inwardly, and we perceived the life of things. We almost didn't know about that there was an outside to things. And we almost didn't know that there was an externality. Now, we're in such a place that we say this is the real world, and if anybody who talks about an inner world whose character is more a character of life than a character of form, we say that they're out of touch with reality. We say they've lost their senses. They're not in touch with the world at all. So we have passed from one extreme of having an inner consciousness that saw life to an exclusively outer consciousness that sees only form. What we have is the potential of bringing about a union where we can see the inner life and the outer form. And in that, there is a great crossover of consciousness that must take place. Right now, our objectivity is in the external world, because everything that we measure, everything that we weigh, everything that we test or that we objectify, it's outwardly in the world of forms. Inwardly, we say everything is subjective. Well, in the process of redeveloping the inward from the kind of objectivity that comes from measuring and seeing things externally, when we internalize that, then the internal world becomes objective, because it is universal. And until we get to the one where everything is totally objective and there is no subjectivity at all, whereas then we will see the external world, the world of forms, we will see as then being subjective. I can only see the front of Catherine now, I can't see her back. And that's a very subjective point of view. And so what we're doing is we're developing a very special kind of consciousness where the things that are now subjective are becoming objective, and the things that are now objective are becoming subjective, and in the process we're developing our self-consciousness. And if we do maintain a self-consciousness in this transition where objectivity and subjectivity are expanded into their opposites, we develop a very special clairvoyance, which we can't really go into, but which I had hoped everybody over the break would have studied by reading the recommended reading of the Surangama Sutra by Buddha, which I even offered to lend somebody a book, but nobody took me up on it, and so you'll have to do without that. I better be careful. I'll try to make this too much like a real school, and that will never do. Now, how all of this relates to the mysteries is what we want to get to, because all of these talks on the myths are based on the mysteries. Now, the modern mysteries and the modern psychology are biased, just as the ancient mysteries and the ancient outlook on the world was biased. In the ancient times, people were afraid of coming into Maya or coming into illusion, and therefore there was a bias to spiritual teachings that taught that the physical was to be eschewed by all means. Well, the modern mysteries are biased toward materialism. And one of the reasons for this is because it's practical. You know, most of the world is in materialism, including all of ourselves. We aspire to a more spiritual understanding, but our consciousness, when we grow up, and we're taught to observe things and have discrete objects outside of ourselves, and we're to emulate our parents in gaining wealth, and everything is based on the clarity of the external world, and then we're told that the spiritual worlds are much fuzzier than that, or much more fluent than that, and that the spiritual worlds, there is so much meaning from so many points of view existent simultaneously. We're unprepared for that. We had this materialistic bias. And if somebody came to us and said real spiritual things to us, we would think that they were in chort or something like that they had lost it, that they were crazy. And so the mysteries have to be biased to where we're at, and that is materialism. And the mysteries are taught by people who are coming from their background. And all of us are coming from a background of materialism. And the new initiates who will do the teaching will themselves be just in the process of throwing off their materialism. So it's not surprising that the mysteries are materialistic in their nature. As a consequence of this, modern mystery wisdom, and especially psychology, are materialistic and outer, and they have a kind of empty abstraction to them. If we look at most renditions of modern mystery wisdom, they talk a lot about worlds and planes and the kinds of forms that live in them and the principles that work through those forms. This is pretty mechanical. In psychology, we learn about syndromes and prodromes and types and the structure and mechanics of the soul, and that's pretty materialistic, probably even more so than the mysteries teachings. Now, it's important to be able to cut through the symbols in a dream or the delusions in a psychological state, and it's important to cut through the illusory nature of the world. But in doing so, we must not forget the life. In very large letters, L-I-F-E, there is a life to the soul, whether we look at it through the mysteries or whether we look at it through the eyes of psychology. And as we have just said, it is through this life that the principles are given living birth. It is true that the truth is eternal, but it is equally true that the truth is reborn each and every moment. It is true that in its very state of beingness, the truth is probably singular. But everything that has come into being, and everything that has come into being that has many, many meanings, all of that came from the life of the one truth. And so it is really important that I think this is a direction that the mysteries teachings, as well as psychology and all science, have to take, is more of a return to life, to actually have the life be born in us. Now, if we look in the writings of modern mystery writers like Max and Rudy, they do talk a lot about principles, but if you read very carefully, they try to avoid some of the subjective aspects of their life so that it doesn't become a personality following, and so that the subjectivity of their personalities is it overcomes the truth that they're trying to live out. But if we look at their writings, we see that they're not just objective writings, but very carefully we can see that there is a life of the Spirit. And that is what we are trying to get to. The life of the Spirit is not so much found in the events or in the forms, but it is found in the story. And the forms live within life in the same way that the facts live inside of a story, or like little animunculi live inside of an ocean of water. And what we're trying to get to is to that life. Now, even though we spend a lot of time talking about principles and ideas, and even though I'm not a very good storyteller, please listen when the only reason I'm going back to mythology at all, which is a really archaic thing, is because by going back we can capture the life as it's found in a story. Probably the best way that we could learn to communicate with each other is what we're trying to do in these talks themselves. And women are more common to doing this than men. Very often, women will tell the same story of a same social circumstance over again and again, but they'll tell it in a different way, and when they do, something different will come out of it. And so what we're trying to do then is get into the story. All right. We've finished the first 2 parts of the first introduction. Now we're ready. The introductions get shorter and shorter as we go on, thank goodness. This isn't even going to last an hour and a half, I don't think, tonight. We're already on page 3, and there are only 15 pages of notes. You didn't let her know what she was in for, did you? Had you known better, you probably would have brought a pillow along. She has been conditioned and hardened to all of this over the years so that she can handle it. All right, this year we have been looking at myths involving triangles. In various ways over the years, we have said that the triangle is a representation of manifest spirit. Last semester, we looked the whole semester at the myth of Oedipus as a kind of Jobian initiation myth. In ways as fundamental as I am currently capable of, I tried to look at the birth of spiritual consciousness in part of a triangulation process. I'm certainly not going to try to repeat that because that was very hard and very long and very deep to go into. So we looked then in the first semester at triangles leading to the life of the spirit in its awakening consciousness. What we're going to attempt to do this semester is look a little bit more at the life of the spirit in form, in matter, and in soul life, in the life of the soul. And so we're going to look at least one other myth, and maybe 2 or 3 if there's time, and we're going to try then and understand the life of the spirit in the realms that it is manifest in, and in that way try to understand it. It sounds pretentious and ambitious, but we'll accomplish a little bit of it, hopefully. To do this, we're going to look at a myth that involves 3 people, actually 4 people in a double triangle. That's going to come out, and it's called the myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Now we're going to get the scholarly introduction to some of the peculiarities of this myth. It is probably the most prevalent myth of all Egyptian culture down through the many dynasties. Re may have been the chief of the gods, the origin of the gods, the most powerful, and there may have been dynasties where people looked at Amun or Aten or other chief divinities, but throughout the dynasties, the myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus has been pretty much a constant, and its influence was probably greater over all the generations of Egyptian peoples than any other. In fact, it influenced the lives of the people from the earliest times all the way into the Christian forms of the forms of Christianity that developed in Egypt. For example, things from the Ethiopian Book of the Dead or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, because of the similarities of the resurrection of Osiris, they were taken right into the resurrection of Christ, and it had that kind of influence. Among all of the myths that we have looked at in all the years that we've been looking at myths in this class, the myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus probably had more currency in the world than any other myth that we've looked at. It has covered all of Africa at one time or another. It has gone... The front door is open. It has gone all the way... Well, I have to wait till he comes back because this will be... Just pull it shut. The myth of Isis and Osiris can be traced as far east as India, and some people even believe that it originated there, but those Hindus believe that everything originated with them.
It would be right to do that.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. They think that the myth of Isa and Isawa which are names for Shiv, are the origin of the Isis myth. And strangely enough, all the way up till the 11th century, people carried the boat of Isis as far north as Germany and Switzerland, that there were cults of Isis even in northern Europe. I don't know if it made it up into Russia. So the number of people and the number of cultures that have been influenced by the Isis myth are probably greater than any other myth in the world right now. It is one of the myths of the Divine Mother, and I'd like to read you one of the more inspired descriptions of Isis. And even though I'm not a good reader, I'm not going to learn to be a good reader unless I do it. It's by Lucian of Apuleius, and it's out of the Golden Ass of Apuleius, which we'll talk a bit more about in a... See if I can find it here. It's only about 16 pages long. About the first watch of the night, when as I slept my first sleep, I awakened with sudden fear and saw the moon shining as bright as when she is at full and seeming as though she leapt out of the sea. Then I thought with myself that this was the most secret time, when that goddess had most puissance and force, considering that all human things be governed by her providence, and that not only beasts private and tame, wild and savage, be made strong by the governance of her light and Godhead, but also things inanimate and without life. And I considered that all bodies in the heavens, the earth, and the seas be by her increasing motions increased, and by her diminishing motions diminished. Then, as weary of all my cruel fortune and calamity, I found good hope and sovereign remedy, though it were very late, to be delivered from my misery by invocation and prayer to the excellent beauty of this powerful goddess. Wherefore, shaking off my drowsy sleep, I arose with a joyful face, and moved toward the great affection to purify myself. I plunged my head 7 times into the water of the sea, which number 7 is convenable and agreeable to holy and divine things, as the worthy sage and philosopher Pythagoras has declared. Then very lively and joyfully, although with a weeping countenance, I made this oration to the puissant goddess. O blessed Queen of Heaven, whether thou be Dame Ceres, which art the original and motherly source of all fruitful things on the earth, who after finding thy daughter Proserpine, through the great joy which thou didst presently conceive, did utterly take away and abolish the food of them of old time, the acorn, and madest the barren and unfruitful ground of Elysius to be plowed and sown, and now givest men more better and milder food. Or whether thou be the celestial Venus, who at the beginning of the world didst couple together male and female with an engendered love, and didst so make an eternal propagation of humankind, being now worshipped within the temple of the Isle of Paphos. Or whether thou be the sister of the god Phoebus, who hast saved so many people by lightening and lessening with thy medicines the pangs of travail, and art now adored at the sacred places of Ephesus, and whether thou be called terrible Proserpine by reason of the deadly howlings which thou yieldest, that thou hast power with triple face to stop and put away the invasion of hags and ghosts which appear to men, and to keep them down in the closures of the earth, which thou didst wander in sundry groves, and art worshipped in divers manners. Thou which dost illumine all cities of the earth by thy feminine light, thou which nourishest all the seeds of the world by thy damp heat, giving thy changing light according to the wanderings near or far of the sun, by whatever name or fashion or shape it is lawful to call upon thee, I pray thee to end my great travail and misery, and raise up my fallen hopes, and deliver me from the wretched fortune which so long pursued me. Grant me peace, if it please thee, to my adversities, for I have endured enough through labor in peril. When I had ended this oration, discovering my plaints to the goddess, I fortuned to fall asleep again upon the same bed, and by, for my eyes were but newly closed, appeared to me from the midst of the sea a divine and venerable face, worshipped even of the gods themselves. Then little by little I seemed to see the whole figure of her body, bright and mounting out of the sea and standing before me. Wherefore I propose to describe her divine semblance, if the poverty of my human speech will suffer me, or the divine power give me power of eloquence rich enough to express it. First she had an abundance of hair, flowing and curling, dispersed and scattering about her divine neck. On the crown of her head she bare many garlands interlaced with flowers. In the middle of her forehead was a plain circlet in the fashion of a mirror, or rather resembling the moon by the light it gave forth. And this was borne upon either side by serpents that seemed to rise out from the furrows of the earth, and above it were blades of corn set out. Her vestment was of finest linen, yielding diverse colors, some were white and shining, some were yellow like the crocus flower, some were rosy red, some were flaming, which troubled my sight and spirit sore. Her cloak was utterly dark, and I won't put you to sleep too long with this. Here and there upon the edge thereof and throughout its surface the stars glimpsed, and in the middle of them was placed the moon in mid-month, which shone like a flame of fire, and round about the whole length and border of that goodly robe was a crown or garland of wreathing unbroken, made with all flowers and fruits. Things quite diverse did she bear, for in her right hand she had a timbrel of brass, a sistrum, a flat piece of metal carved in manner of a girdle, wherein passed not many rods through the periphery of it. And when with her arm she moved these triple cords, they gave forth a shrill and clear sound. In her left hand she bare a cup of gold like unto a boat, upon a handle whereof in the upper part, which is best seen, an asp lifted up his head with wide swelling throat. Her odoriferous feet were covered with shoes interlaced and wrought with victorious palm. Thus the divine shape, breathing out the pleasant spice of fertile Arabia, disdained not with her holy voice to utter these words to me. I won't go into that because it's a little too complicated for me to read, and it names all kinds of goddesses and things like that. So we're talking about a myth that involves the Divine Mother. If you can read between the lines in the Golden Ass of Apuleius, it is an initiatory work. He who has eyes, let him see. And it talks about a lot of the mysteries. In fact, it's the first place I know of where he talks about seeing at the winter solstice, seeing in the ethers right through the earth and seeing the midnight sun. And he cries out, "We who have seen the midnight sun." Now, we're talking about this myth of Isis and Osiris, which is the most universal throughout Egypt and has probably influenced most of the world. The peculiar thing about it is that despite all of the hieroglyphs and all the papyri that we have from Egypt of all different dynasties, we have no Egyptian source for the myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. There is not a complete rendition anywhere. The only near complete rendering that we have outside of the ethers, is the letter of Plutarch to Kalia. And that's what we're going to use, and we aren't going to suffer from it. We're going to use the version that is out of Thrice Greatest Hermes. Tim tells us that there are 4 copies of Thrice Greatest. You don't have to read all of this. You're only going to be reading about 25 pages in the first volume. And there are 4 copies in the university library, and you can probably get a hold of them. It's called Thrice Greatest Hermes, and it is translated by G.R.S. Mead. We're not going to suffer for this because there's another version that you can get at the university bookstore. There's a Harvard Classics version. But we don't want the Harvard Classics version because it's done by a scholar. G.R.S. Mead was an associate of Madame Blavatsky. He had one foot planted in mysticism, well planted in mysticism. The other foot was well planted in scholarship. And of all of the people that I have ever read that have taken mystery writings from the classical period and have translated them, I think G.R.S. Mead does the best of all. Thomas Taylor was a good classical scholar also, but he was too narrow-minded as a Platonist that he was rigid, and you don't get as much. What you get from him is reliable, but you don't get as much from him. Mead is more willing to read between the lines, and he has much, much more knowledge of the mysteries. And he's even willing to speculate, and he's gentleman enough to tell you when he is speculating. His output as a translator is tremendous, and it is prodigious. He has translated a lot of the apocryphal and the mystery writings of primitive Christianity. He has translated voluminously pre- and post-Christian Gnosticism. In fact, he has 2 of the best renditions of Gnostical works, I think, available anywhere. He has translated a lot of Platonism and Neoplatonism. Pythagoreanism and Neo-Pythagoreanism. He has translated works from the Chaldean mysteries, and he has translated Sanskrit scriptures. He has quite a few of the Upanishads that he has translated, and in all of them he gives them a mystery flavor. He was an ardent aspirant himself and a quester. In fact, he edited a magazine that was for questing students for a good number of years, and that's where a lot of his translations came out. Now, to Plutarch. There is some confusion or some potential confusion because there are 2 Plutarchs. The one later in history, 350 to 430 A.D., lived in Athens probably his entire life, and he was a Neoplatonist in the academy in Athens. He held the chair of Plato right before it was held by Proclus, the man that we read so much several years ago, and we did that study of the theology of Plato. The earlier Plutarch is the one that we're interested in, and he's the most famous. He lived from 446 A.D. to 120 A.D. He was born in a small town outside of Athens in Boeotia, and he was educated in Athens and most likely at Plato's Academy. He lived about 3 centuries before the other academy. He lived 46 A.D. to 120 A.D. So he was contemporaneous. He was contemporaneous with Christ. or at least some of the disciples of Christ. He traveled to Rome, where he lectured on philosophy, and he was so famous that he was given the job of educating Hadrian, the emperor. He was very much liked, and he was given the title of Counselor of Greece by Trajan, or Trajan, I don't know how you pronounce it. And later on, Hadrian, in gratitude, made him procurator of all Greece. And he was a magistrate in his own town, but the big thing was that despite his erudition in both Greek and Latin, he was very much involved with the mysteries. His most famous work is 46 Parallel Lives of Noble Greeks and Romans, which was a very politic thing to do, to not be too pro-Greek or too pro-Roman. And he wrote some very interesting things. Beside Isis, Osiris, and Horus, he wrote a book that was much later on quite influential in Christian poetry, called On the Cessation of Oracles. And it goes into, from the viewpoint of the evolution of consciousness, why all the oracles had to shut down. Doesn't mention the Christ as a factor in that, but he didn't know about that. The reason he was interested in that topic was because, remember, last semester we talked a lot about the oracle at Delphi that did go quiet. Well, he was a priest in the Pythian cult of Apollo, and he was closely connected to the oracle. In fact, the On Isis and Osiris that we're going to be reading was written to one of the high priestesses named Clea, which itself may be a code name. That may be numerological or something like that. They did a lot of that. And it is a letter to her that was a historical and scholarly letter that we're going to be reading. Plutarch was also an initiate into the Dionysian mysteries that we talked about when we talked about Sophocles last semester. And he was a high hierophant in the Dionysian mysteries. He was almost certainly an initiate in the Eleusinian mysteries, and it's very likely that he was an Orphic initiate as well through his connection with the academy. And as we're going to see as we go through the myth, we're going to see that he was quite familiar with the symbols. Beside these things, he was an initiate into Orosaic and Isisaic mysteries. The greater mysteries were the mysteries of Osiris, and the lesser mysteries were the mysteries of Isis, and so he was initiated into them as well, though I don't know whether he was initiated in Egypt or when he was in Rome, since they were prevalent in both places. So even though we don't have an authentic Egyptian source for our myth, we've got a very good one because it's told by somebody who is initiated. There's something about Plutarch that is peculiar that makes him really desirable to us. Scholars are mixed about him. As a historian and as a person of character and honesty, they treat him as an impeccable source of truth. But they don't like him because he says curious things that sound like superstitions or non sequiturs in his writings. And the reason for this is that those things are mystery symbols. They're part of an idiomatic language, or they're part of a symbolic language. And for us, they're very helpful because when you're reading a myth, or when you're reading something by a mystery student, or when you're interpreting a dream, it is those non sequiturs, those really weird, odd things that don't seem to make any sense, that those are the ingress into the dream or into the story that you're trying to get at. And so the reason that he's poo-pooed by some scholars for saying some weird things, those incongruencies are the very reasons we want to be reading him. All right. We have finished our second introduction, and now we have only the local introduction and the mythical introduction to go into, and then we'll be done for the night. The local introduction is that there's going to be a peculiarity about our rendition of Isis and Osiris, and that is that about 6 years ago, we looked at myths that were used by mystery schools as part of the initiation ritual. At that time, we did this same myth. Now the problem is, how do we do it all over again? And for me, the problem is, it's going to be similar in that I'm not going to cut out any parts of the story, and I'm going to address the same main parts of the story, but I'm going to bring out different sides from those same things that I addressed, and I'm going to bring out different parallel material. Last time, one of the things we did last time, we won't do this time. Last time we talked about the path of initiation being written in the stars in pictorial stories, and we went into the full moons of winter and where they occur, each of them indicating or replicating an episode in the life of Isis as she searched for Osiris. We won't do that this time because that isn't part of the story. We will go through those episodes in the story, but we won't go into it in that way. Instead, we're going to bring out the triangular material, and we're going to try and look at the life of the spirit in the soul. And this is really important for me because we might call this short series of talks the Krishnamurti series of talks, because Krishnamurti tried never to be quotable, and he tried to culture bad memory. He tried not to do anything from memory, but instead he tried to rely on intuition and meditating on the spot and recreating new each and every time that he did something, so that you learn to surrender to intuition, and you learn to do something new each and every time. I'm seeing that I've gone a little bit overboard in that, so I won't become too much that way, but this will be a homage to Krishnamurti then. All right. I think we're ready to go into the primary introduction, and that is the mythical introduction. I do recommend the earlier version, and I will sell tapes at $2 a tape of the earlier version for those who want to read it. I have a set that has the whole series on the mystery myths that has gone all the way to Japan and back. It's gone all the way to Missouri and Michigan, and it's now in Minnesota. And it'll be back in 9 weeks, and if anybody wants to loan it at that time. You've heard of Marty, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got it.
Okay. So, yeah. All right, so we'll have a set back. Now we have the mythical history. And the mythical history is going to be the same thing as the myth itself. It's going to be a repeat. Only it's going to be more radically different than the original time. 3 years ago, we were in the midst of that long it was a 3-year series on myths of hierarchy, where we started out with hierarchy in Hindu mythology, and then we did hierarchy in Egyptian, and then finally hierarchy in Greek. And last year we finally killed it off with hierarchy in Northern European mythology. Well, at that time we had the general introduction to going right back to the beginning, right back to the source, to the one indivisible. And that's what we always try to do as mystics. We have an occult temperament, and we try to get to the bottom of things. And getting to the bottom of things means going to the top of things. And it is going right to the very beginning. We're going to do a very short but a different version of looking at the creation story, one of the two creation stories which are very similar to each other, from the Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's very, very beautiful. And in their story, it's told by Re, who is the first, the origin of everything. And it's told in a very sanguine way. It's told all in the first person. It could be egoistic, but they use the I quite freely. So let's do a little bit of that. I'll try and be short because I am running out of energy and I'm getting a little bit of a sore throat. Ray says, I came into being. I was, or I became, the center of what came into being. The center of all what came into being after my coming into being. After I came into being, many things came into being, coming forth from my mouth. Pretty strong as far as individualism is concerned. Working from the back to the front, it is, like most cosmogonies, a word-born cosmogony. Before there is even a body to the divinity, which comes many verses further on, things are coming from the mouth, the word. All of the things that come into being after the one that was there first, and they come out of its mouth. Now, the emphasis, if we look at the grammar of it, I came into being, or the creator of everything that came into being after my coming into being, all of the emphasis is on coming into being, which is exactly what you expect in defining self. What is implied is that there is a non-being, and that non-being is in some way greater or other than being. So it has a complete silence. It speaks out as it knows itself. It speaks itself out. It's coming into being, and it's talking out of itself, and everything is being created. But very tacitly, it is giving cognizance to what we've been calling the dark Madonna, the absolute. It's being silent about it, as one should always be about the absolute, because there's nothing that can really be said about the absolute. This is immediately contrasted and dramatized by pointing out the non-existence of things, which sort of takes the pinnings out of you. Like, first of all, you cling to the existence of Ray and his coming into being, but then everything is talked about in terms of non-existence. It says, not existed heavens, not existed earth, not existed the things of the earth. And then comes the huge clue. I raised them up out of Nu, the primordial abyss of water, from the state of inactivity. Not found I a place to stand wherein. in that line is intentionally trying to knock you out of any materialistic dependence of any kind. You have no grounds to stand on. First you have this being which is very strong in the statement of its existence and everything else that exists, but everything that exists was not there first before it was there. So you can't say that this is part of a continuum. You can't say that this is a steady state cosmology as some astronomers would have it. This is saying that not things were the state of it all before that. Now, we have to look at it almost like the ancient Egyptians if we're going to appreciate this in any way that's going to be practical in our life. Re, we know, is the sun. It's fire, it's light, it's heat, it's life, it's the source of being. First, it dramatically defines itself relative to non-being. Then, as it knows itself or becomes itself, it creates things. But it also knows itself from the non-existence of those things before they were created. And that they're created from inert water, which is a way of talking about like the sea of space, or the womb of the absolute. And inert water, and water is sort of like the resistless resistance. The ultimate resistance resists nothing, and therefore you have nothing to stand on. So, this, as in almost all creation myths, is a story of fire and water, of spirit in time and space, or fluidic matter in space. Also, it is of willing and of feeling. Clearly, the whole myth is a myth of awakening. But the way it says, I came into being. And it's awakening that is defined by the interaction of fire and water. And there is in nature a phenomenon involving fire and water that very clearly parallels this. And it very clearly parallels what we are trying to do in our lives. And that phenomenon is called spontaneous combustion. And so we want to look a little bit at spontaneous combustion. You know what it is. Sometimes people throw a few moist, oily rags in a corner and suddenly they start burning. Or you take hay that's too wet and you place it in a barn and it springs into flames. The classic is what? Potassium permanganate, and what's the other compound? Yeah, there's a real slow one with potassium permanganate, and I forget what the other compound is. And you put them together, and they warm up, and then they start to smoke, and pretty soon they're sparkling with light, and that's a really slow, spontaneous combustion. What? Glycerin? It might be glycerin. I'm not sure. I don't remember. I remember it from my high school days when it happened, because we didn't even know it. The high school teacher, it was a great guy, really great guy. The kids who would fall asleep in class got to learn about the qualities of ammonia, because he'd quietly walk over to them and hold the ammonia bottle under their nose. And he starts talking one day in front of the room. There was a big lab bench up there, and he's talking about the phenomenon of spontaneous combustion, and pretty soon there's a little bit of smoke starts rising from the desk, and pretty soon it's just spewing out sparks and everything, and then there's a big burst of flame. And he says, and that's spontaneous combustion. It was one of the big experiences, of my high school days. But at any rate, there is a purely chemical spontaneous combustion, but even there, it is between elements that are highly fiery and compounds or elements that are highly watery in their nature. And we won't go into that. But the most common form of spontaneous combustion has to do with wet fire. And that has to do, the wet fire is associated with nitrogen and rot. Like in your compost pile, if you put your hand in there, it's so bad that you can just about blister your skin. It gets so hot. And it has to do with bacterial action, but mostly it has to do with the right mixture of fire and water. And so what we're talking about, oh, don't worry, it won't bother you at all. So what we're looking at then is the necessity for the birth of light, or the birth of waking consciousness, which is what the cosmos is all about, the necessity of waking ourselves up, and that is not merely an act of will. Yes, we do draw on something deep within ourselves, which is the will to live, which is the will to be, and we learn to give ourselves to that, because as subtle as it is indeed a very great power. But that is not enough alone. When the great Hiram was reborn as Saint Germain, and he was in the court of Louis XVI doing all of those wonderful miracles, like wrapping diamonds together and making a big one out of them and speaking every language in the world and everything, he said rather casually at the royal table at one time, he said, the philosopher's stone is not made by fire alone, but it is made by the mixture of fire and water. And if he was indeed the original Hiram that had the molten sea with the water thrown in it that exploded, if he was that same individual, how he could say that so casually. So this is a great principle. If we have only one side, only the will to be, and we develop that cold willfulness, we have the Nazi principle. The Nazis had the will to power, but they had no feeling. They had no love. They had no imagination. They had it. They tried to deny it. You know what would happen with Nazis? That some of the worst executioners, they would go to churches and they would sing the old hymns, and the tears would stream down their cheeks, and the next day they'd go and butcher Jews again. It's because they gave for a moment some relief in a very false way to their feelings, and the need for feeling was so great that it just burst out of them. And this is that same balancing of opposite poles again that Carl Jung talks about, the same society that worshipped the virgin burned witches at the stake. That kind of consciousness. And the same people that had the will to power did not allow the feminine to come into its proper role. And so we had that kind of quality. So basically what we're saying is that to give birth to our consciousness, we have to have the melding of fire and water. In fact, I believe that when our feelings are mixed together with our will to be, that the light begins to burn more spontaneously in us, and that we can actually sense in our inner being what is being born by that very union. And so that's the main philosophical principle that we want to talk about tonight, is that that we have to, in our spontaneous giving birth to ourselves, in coming to more and more wide-awake consciousness, that isn't just an act of will, but it is an act of will that must be attended to by the right kind of feeling. It has to be nurtured, it has to be loved, it has to be imagined into existence. We can't wake by ourselves alone. We have to look to things beyond ourselves. I'm skipping a lot of material here because it's just a little bit much. So at any rate, he comes out of sleep and he defines himself. Now this is the whole idea, all of this spontaneous combustion and all this, I'll come to something more a little further on. From there, the text goes on to say, I work the charm with my heart. Already he is recognizing the heart, and he's already beginning to center on himself. He has no place to stand, so all he can do is center on his whole own being, and he can contemplate his own being. And he says something really interesting. I laid a foundation in Ma, and I made every attribute. Now Ma is order or justice or law. Maat, M-A-A-T, is the goddess of justice. And here we have the same identical philosophical creation story that you liked from years and years ago when we talked about the philosophical creation stories. The first thing that was created was darkness or night. And the first thing that night created was love. And the first thing that love created was the law. And everything else was created from the law, from the cosmic feedback. So here we have Ray being spontaneously born from a will to be or a will to life within himself. And what he is born in, he sees as the inert, watery being, and all the things that don't exist, he first pre-exists them by making negatives, by their not being, and then gives them reality by externalizing them. But he can only do that after he has made all of the attributes. And those attributes come from a foundation of law that is what is born from fire and water. The light produces an understanding of the truth that is objectified, and when that is objectified, that is the principle of principles. All other attributes or principles come from that one. When that one is born, the others are born from that. He says, I was alone because I had not spit shu, had not yet pissed tefnut. That is to say, he was alone in his selfness because he had not differentiated other selves. The attributes through which they came into being were there, but they hadn't come into being. Now, this is really, really far out stuff. He says, I made a foundation in my heart of my own will, and there came into being the multitudes of things which came into birth out of the things which came into being out of their births. Meaning to say that this is a progressive, that things come into being out of the ideas that came into being out of me. it's a restatement of everything that was said in the negatives. Not was shu, not was tefnut. And from all of those negatives, see, this is the same thing we've been talking about all year. It's like saying, when self is born and it realizes that there is not self, that division becomes internalized. And then you say things could be from that internal division. The internal division is between will and imagination. Fire and water again. When you say things could be. And then by giving yourself into producing those things, first producing the ideas, and then the ideas must conceive the things. It's like, like the opening chapters of the Bible. And the twofold heaven and earth gave birth to a twofold heaven and earth. Meaning to say that there is a transcendental creation that is followed by a phenomenal creation, and that the ideas produce concretes. Now this is pretty abstract stuff, and can you picture this? This is all written in hieroglyphs, chiseled into stone, that they carried ideas that are this subtle and that are this lofty and transcendent, and how they can do that, how modern archaeologists can read the hieroglyphs and come to these understandings. Of course, they don't come to these philosophical understandings, they just make the translations. Too bad that they don't get the other part. It must be a terrible destiny to have to write all those things down and not be living the life that you can appreciate the inside of all of this and say, oh, it was a homespun little religion that they had. They said a lot of gibberish gobbledygook and such like that. Sad, sad, sad. All right. The next line is a little unusual. I masturbated myself. I joined myself in embrace with my shadow. Again, the masturbation, we're talking, this is we're going over the same material from another point of view again. The masturbation, we've talked about this problem before, so I won't dwell on it, is you have to get from unity to duality in some way. And this is a substantial way of trying to do that. And then he embraced his own shadow. If he's the light, he embraced the shadow of its own light, even though there wasn't something solid for the shadow to be produced by. So the shadow had to be the reflective consciousness of what could be of him from the unknown. So it's a really sophisticated understanding. The seed fell into my mouth. So he had to have been in fetal position. As we understand the human, that if he masturbated, it's very, I cut some of it out, it's very literal. He says, I masturbated myself with my own hand, and the seed fell into my mouth, which could only happen if you were in a fetal position, which means that he was internalizing. Like the externalized God that is bent backwards into a circle is different than the fetal. The fetal is when it is still developing and it's still turning inward and it's still getting to know itself in insecurity, and only as it straightens up again into the pole-like state does it come to the division between the within and the out, until finally it becomes all external. It's a very, very interesting story. And he says, I spit out shu, and shu is moist air, and I pissed out tefnut. That is, he had a polarity, that the moist air went up and the water went down, and this is the birth of the worlds. It's a recapitulation of what has gone before in consciousness, only here it is in the pole of matter. We're almost done. We don't have a whole lot to say. And we'll skip a whole lot of the text because it's a lot of repetitions. And since this is not a course on cosmogony, we'll just skip a lot of that. And after they're born, he says, they made me to be weak. After I became from one God, three, and after into this earth. Meaning as if to say that the complete strength of being that is found in ultimate unity gets weaker and weaker and weaker, first as it is divided into numerous hierarchies and divinities, and even all the more so as the dream is realized into the states of matter and all the forms as far as the will can carry it, until it has given its will to live, so that it has sacrificed its entire life to realize the dream, and in that realization have new things come to birth. It's quite a good understanding. Then approximately it says, Shu and Tefnut brought me my eye in their train, meaning to say that the objective external vision couldn't be had, the external objectivity, not the internal objectivity, that was there all along, but the external objectivity that requires an eye couldn't be until there was the differentiation into Shu and Tefnut. That's a triangular principle like we talked about last time. And then, after that, it said, after I had sight, I constituted my members. That is to say, after the eye of the threefold spirit was born, and spirit could see itself through a being, through the third, then it could see itself into existence. The best musician I've ever heard on guitar said, anything I can see in my mind I can do with my fingers. And he did almost impossible holds on a guitar neck that I've tried. I've sat there for hours and hours and hours. I can't even do them in slow motion, static. I can't do that. And he could do them flying along. But it is like saying that this is not just an imagination where everything is perfect in the imagination, and that you hold it until it becomes manifest in the world, but that there is the imagination and the interaction of the imagination with reality, because a painting or a sculpture or a talk like this is never what I imagine. It is what you have to see by the interaction with the stuff itself, with the unknown that is in the matter, and that by that interaction you see things into existence. And he couldn't know the members of his body until he had first until he first had his eye, and he couldn't have his eye until he first polarized and produced the first triad with Shu and Tefnut. Having done that, he constituted his members, and when he saw them, he wept. And out of the weeping came man and woman. That this is not only man and woman, but man and woman in their two differentiations. One is the masculine and feminine within the gods, in Shu and Tefnut, and in the human beings. We've talked a lot about that when we talked about Hindu mythology, and we talked about the projection of a self from the threefold spirit into the dimensionality of having the fourth point in the Immaculate Conception of a tetrahedron, when we talked about patriarchs, whether it is Adam or whether it is Swayambhus, or whether it is the men and women born out of Ra seeing his body, or Re seeing his body. The patriarchs represent the extensions through the different worlds and through the different lives of the different permutations of humans as we go through different periods of existence. It's a very, very beautiful way of stating the principle of as above, so below, where the whole idea of the God or the Godhead is taken through all of the different generations of patriarchs.